5 true scary stories from the House of Horrors, uncovering a family's darkest secrets. The mansion loomed at the edge of the forest like a relic of another era, its towering spires and weather-worn facade whispering secrets to anyone who dared linger too long. I had driven hours from the city to reach this isolated place, compelled by whispers and half-forgotten tales of the House of Horrors. As a journalist, I had spent years chasing stories of the macabre, but this assignment wasn't just another ghost story. It was personal. This house had been the subject of countless rumors, a nexus of tragedy and mystery for over 150 years. Families had vanished, visitors fled in terror, and the occasional intrepid investigator never returned. Its history was a patchwork of missing persons reports, unexplained deaths, and strange sightings. And yet, here it stood, as unyielding as the granite foundation it rested on. I stepped out of my car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots swallowed by the vast silence that enveloped the estate. The mansion was more imposing than I had anticipated, its darkened windows like empty eye sockets staring into the soul. As I pushed open the heavy oak door, a gust of cold air rushed past me, carrying with it a faint smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic. The entry hall was cavernous, its high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Dust motes floated in the dim light, seeping through stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns on the worn wooden floor. I set down my bag and pulled out my flashlight, its beams slicing through the gloom. The house was as silent as a tomb, but its silence felt alive, as though it were listening. I began my exploration cautiously, documenting everything with my recorder and camera. The house seemed to change with each turn, a hallway that stretched farther than it appeared, a door that seemed to close on its own. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind set my nerves on edge. Then I found it. It was tucked away in a corner of the library, hidden beneath a layer of dust and cobwebs. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and edges frayed, as though it had been handled by countless hands over the decades. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting inside spidery and uneven. As I flipped through the first few entries, I realized this wasn't just any journal. It was a collection of confessions, each more chilling than the last. I sat down in the library's worn armchair, my flashlight balanced on the desk. The first entry began with a simple warning. To those who read this, the house knows you now. It will watch, it will listen, and it will not let you go. The words sent a shiver down my spine, but curiosity overruled caution. I turned the page and began to read. As the first story unfolded, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Shadows danced on the periphery of my vision, and a faint sound, like the distant clinking of glasses, echoed through the mansion. My grip on the journal tightened. The deeper I delved into its pages, the more the house seemed to awaken around me, as though the stories themselves were summoning something long dormant. Yet I couldn't stop. The journalist in me demanded answers, and the haunted soul within me yearned to understand. This house, this collection of horrors, it wasn't just a place of death and despair. It was a predator, feeding on the fears of those who dared enter. And now it had found me. Story 1, Abandoned Dining Halls. The journal trembled slightly in my hands as I turned to the first story. The faded ink bled into the aged paper, but the dread it conveyed was sharp and vivid. The entry was written by a man named Charles Halstead, a father who had made the regrettable choice of staying at the mansion with his family for a single night. We had arrived just before dusk, my wife and our 2 children, Eleanor and Jacob, bounding out of the car with the unrestrained energy of youth. The house was imposing, yes, but also strangely inviting. I reasoned that its reputation was merely the product of local lore meant to keep thrill-seekers away. The caretaker handed me the keys with a grim look, muttering something about avoiding the dining hall after dark. I dismissed it as the usual dramatics that come with old properties and set about settling in. The house itself was magnificent, with polished wood floors, chandeliers that had long since gone dark, and windows framed with heavy velvet drapes. That evening, we decided to eat in the dining hall. I thought it would be amusing to indulge in the grandeur of the room, with its sprawling oak table and faded portraits watching us from the walls. The children played with the ancient silverware, their giggles filling the cavernous space as in lit a few candles for ambience. As the evening wore on, a peculiar chill crept into the room, despite the fireplace crackling with fresh logs. Eleanor, who had been twirling a napkin in her lap, suddenly froze. "Daddy," she whispered, her small voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" At first, I heard nothing but the occasional creak of the house settling. Then, faintly, the sound of clinking glasses reached my ears, as though an unseen party were beginning just beyond the edge of perception. It was followed by murmurs, indistinct but unmistakably human, and shot me a wary glance, but I shrugged it off. "It's probably the wind," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. The sounds grew louder, closer. The children stopped their play, wide-eyed as the noise crescendoed into a symphony of revelry. The air seemed to thicken, and the scent of decayed food wafted through the room, so potent that it covered her mouth with her hand. Then we saw them. Faint at first, like shadows cast by flickering candlelight, figures began to materialize around the long table. They wore clothing that appeared decades, if not centuries, out of date. Elegant suits, elaborate dresses, all tattered and stained with something dark. And grabbed the children and backed away, but I stayed rooted to the spot, mesmerized. The figures did not acknowledge us. They were entirely absorbed in their grotesque feast. Plates piled high with rancid meat, glasses filled with a thick, crimson liquid. I told myself it was wine, though my stomach churned at the thought. One figure at the head of the table raised a goblet as if to make a toast. He looked skeletal, his face a ghastly mask of stretched skin and hollow eyes. As his bony fingers clinked the glass, he seemed to pause, his head tilting slightly, almost as if he could see me. I stepped forward, compelled by some irrational mix of bravery and curiosity. "Enough!" I shouted, the word echoing against the cavernous walls. "This is some kind of trick." The moment the words left my mouth, the figure's head snapped toward me fully, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. The room seemed to implode. The spectral diners turned in unison, their faces grotesquely animated, teeth bared and blackened. I staggered back, but it was too late. A searing pain shot through my arms, and I dropped to my knees. The apparitions flickered and dissolved, leaving me alone in the room. Alone, save for the claw marks now etched into my skin, deep and red, as though I'd been mauled by some unseen beast. The journal's ink smudged slightly as I read the final lines of Charles's entry. He had fled the house that night, taking his family with him, but he claimed the dining hall had never let him go. "The scent," he wrote, "stayed with me for years. Decayed food, rotting flesh, a banquet of horrors. I can still hear the clinking glasses in my nightmares, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel the phantom pain of those claw marks. The house took a piece of me, and it will take more if you let it." The room around me grew colder, and I caught a faint whiff of something rancid. My flashlight flickered. I placed the journal down carefully, my pulse quickening. I wasn't alone in this house, but I couldn't stop now. There were more stories to uncover, and whatever haunted this mansion would not let me leave until I knew them all. Story 2. Mysterious Locked Rooms. The journal's second entry was penned in a shaky, hurried hand, the ink blotched as though the writer's fingers had trembled while recounting their tale. This was the account of a young couple, Samantha and Eric Delaney, who had rented the mansion for what was meant to be a romantic getaway. Instead, they found something that would haunt them forever. Eric had always been fascinated by old houses, their creaking floors and history-laden walls. When he stumbled upon the listing for the mansion, he was immediately captivated. A hidden gem, the advertisement had called it, with sprawling wings and antique furnishings. When we arrived, I'll admit it was beautiful, though eerie in its quietude. The landlord, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a weary expression, met us at the door. "One rule," he said, his voice gravelly. "Don't try to open the locked door in the west wing." Eric laughed it off, his hand tightening around mine. "What's behind it? Old ghosts." The landlord's response was chilling. He leaned closer, his face hardening. "Just heed my warning," he said, before walking away without another word. The West Wing became a forbidden treasure in Eric's mind, a secret he couldn't resist unraveling. On our second day in the house, his curiosity got the better of him. "We have to check it out," he whispered as we explored the hallway leading to the locked door. It was an unassuming oak door, its brass handle dulled with age. But as we stood there, I noticed the faintest sound, a scratching like fingernails scraping against wood. "Do you hear that?" I asked, clutching Eric's arm. He nodded, his face pale but determined. "Probably just a rat trapped inside." The noise grew louder that night, echoing through the mansion's silence. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as though something was trying to claw its way out. By the third night, neither of us could sleep. The incessant sound burrowed into our minds, and Eric finally snapped. "I can't take this anymore," he said, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the West Wing. I followed reluctantly, my heart pounding as we approached the door. The scratching stopped the moment we stood before it, replaced by an unnerving silence. Eric tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. "Let's go back," I urged. But Eric was already on his knees, fumbling with a set of tools. It took only a few minutes for him to pick the lock, the soft click echoing ominously. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in pale moonlight filtering through a cracked window. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overpowering. And then we saw them. Dozens, no, hundreds, of antique dolls lined the room, perched on shelves, clustered on the floor, even hanging from the walls. Their glassy eyes glinted in the moonlight, staring directly at us. "This is insane," I whispered, but Eric stepped further in, compelled by some unseen force. As he reached for one of the dolls, the moonlight seemed to shift, casting a cold glow across the room. The dolls' heads turned in unison, their blank stares focusing intently on Eric. I screamed, pulling him back toward the door, but it was too late. One of the dolls, a porcelain figure in a tattered red dress, tilted its head and spoke. "You're next," it whispered, its voice faint but unmistakable. Eric stumbled back, dropping his flashlight, which rolled across the floor and illuminated a grotesque sight. The doll's mouth had opened, revealing rows of tiny, sharp teeth. We bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind us. As soon as we were in the hallway, we heard the lock click, as if the room itself had sealed us out. The next morning, shaken but desperate for answers, we confronted the landlord. "The West Wing," Eric began, his voice hoarse. "The room with the dolls." The landlord's expression froze. "Dolls?" he asked, his tone sharp. "The locked room," I cried. "The one you warned us about." His face darkened, confusion mingling with fear. "There's no locked room in the West Wing," he said, his voice trembling. "There never has been." The entry ended abruptly, with Samantha noting that they left the house that same day, never looking back. She wrote of nightmares that followed them for years, dreams where the dolls waited in the shadows, whispering that same chilling phrase, "You're next." As I read, I felt the air in the room grow heavier. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. With trembling hands, I turned the page, bracing myself for the next story. The house wasn't done with me yet. Story 3, Haunted Guest Rooms. The journal's next entry was written in neat, professional handwriting, starkly different from the frantic scrawls of the previous tale. It was the account of a traveling businessman named Thomas Grayson, who had spent a single, unforgettable night in the mansion's guest room. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. I had stayed in hundreds of hotels and ghost houses during my career, some as old and creaky as this one, but none of them ever left me feeling as unsettled as this place. My company had booked me a room here due to its proximity to a potential client. When I arrived, the house seemed ordinary enough, perhaps a little too large and empty, but charming in a way that historic homes often are. The landlord was polite but distant, showing me to the guest room on the second floor. "Don't mind the noises," he said cryptically as he handed me the key. Old houses like this tend to creak at night. The guest room was modest but comfortable, with a canopy bed, a writing desk, and an antique mirror mounted above a small dresser. I set down my suitcase and loosened my tie, relieved to finally have a moment to myself after a long day. It started with a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind seeping through the old window panes. But as I leaned closer, I could make out distinct words. "Thomas!" I froze. The voice was soft, childlike, and impossibly close, as though someone were standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Dismissing it as my imagination, I tried to settle into the bed and read over some notes from my meeting. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Thomas! Thomas!" I searched the room, checking the closet, under the bed, even behind the heavy curtains, but I found nothing. Just as I was about to sit down, I noticed something odd on the floor. Vet footprints. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. Bare, human-sized prints, glistening on the old wooden floorboards, leading from the door to the mirror above the dresser. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail, my heart pounding with each step. When I reached the mirror, I saw nothing unusual at first, but as I stared at my reflection, the room seemed to grow colder. Then I saw it, a faint, ghostly outline of a child standing behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, and my breath came out in visible puffs, as if the temperature had plummeted. And then I felt it, a hand, icy cold, gripping my arm. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My gaze darted back to the mirror, and the child's reflection was clearer now. Pale, hollow-eyed, with water dripping from his hair and clothes. He raised a small hand and pointed toward the window. "Leave!" The word was etched into the frost that had mysteriously formed on the glass. The grip on my arm tightened, and I yanked myself free, stumbling back. The room seemed to shudder around me, the whispers rising to a deafening cacophony. I didn't pack. I didn't care about my things. I ran, tripping down the stairs, fumbling with the locks on the front door. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the mansion shrinking in my rearview mirror. Thomas's entry concluded with a chilling detail. His watch, a gift from his father, had stopped at exactly 12:13 a.m., the moment he felt the cold grip. It never worked again. As I finished reading, I glanced at the antique mirror in the room where I sat. It was eerily similar to the one Thomas had described. My reflection seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I reached for the journal, flipping quickly to the next entry, desperate to distract myself from the growing unease. Whatever secrets the house held, they weren't going to let me leave without learning more. Story 4. Enigmatic Stairwells. The journal's penmanship shifted again, the next entry written in hurried, uneven strokes. This one belonged to a man named Ethan Cole, the leader of a local ghost hunting group. The team had ventured into the mansion seeking proof of the paranormal, armed with an arsenal of cameras, recorders, and bravado. But their night yielded something far darker than they ever anticipated. We arrived at dusk, the perfect time to begin an investigation. The house loomed before us like a sleeping giant, its dark windows watching us approach. I had researched the mansion extensively, piecing together its sinister history, and it seemed the perfect spot for our group's next exploration. There were 5 of us: me, Jason, Emily, Sarah, and Mark. We set up base camp in the front parlor, testing our equipment and planning our routes. The air inside was heavy, tinged with a faint metallic smell. None of us mentioned it, but I could see the unease on their faces. The first few hours were uneventful. Creaking floorboards, distant tapping noises, and faint whispers that could easily be attributed to wind. But then we found the staircase. It wasn't on any of the blueprints I'd reviewed, and I was sure we hadn't passed it earlier in the evening. A narrow spiral staircase, wrought iron with intricate carvings, descended into darkness where the west wing should have been. Jason was the first to speak. "This wasn't here before, right?" We all shook our heads. "Let's check it out," I said, curiosity getting the better of me. We turned on our cameras and flashlights, aiming them toward the stairs. Emily stayed behind, uneasy about descending into an unknown void, while the rest of us began the careful journey downward. The steps seemed endless. With each rotation of the spiral, the temperature dropped. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead, and the walls around us seemed to close in. Whispers floated up from the depths, indistinct at first, but growing louder with every step. They sounded like children, laughing and calling out in sing-song tones. "Come play. Come find us." Mark stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight. We all nodded, our breaths visible in the freezing air. "Let's go back," Sarah suggested, but before we could respond, Jason pointed his flashlight ahead. "Look, there's something down there." At the bottom of the stairs stood a door, slightly ajar. A faint golden light spilled out, flickering like candlelight. Against all reason, Jason pushed ahead. "It's just a door. What's the worst that could happen?" The door slammed shut behind him the moment he stepped through. We shouted his name, pounding on the wood, but no sound came back except for the whispers. They were louder now, almost deafening, and they weren't coming from the other side of the door anymore. They were coming from the walls. Sarah screamed, pulling me back up the stairs. Mark hesitated, his flashlight scanning the space where the door had been moments earlier. "It's gone," he whispered. The staircase was gone too. All that remained was a solid, featureless wall. Jason's screams shattered the silence. "It's here," he shouted, his voice distant and distorted. "It's..." And then nothing. No footsteps, no more screaming. Just an oppressive silence that pressed on us like a physical weight. We ran. When we reached the parlor, Emily was waiting for us, her face pale and confused. "Where's Jason?" she asked. I couldn't answer. None of us could. Jason's equipment reappeared 2 weeks later. It was neatly arranged on the mansion's front porch, each piece cleaned and in perfect working order. His camera still had footage on it. The last video showed him standing at the bottom of the staircase, the golden light reflecting off his terrified face. He turned to the camera one last time, whispering, "Don't follow them." The recording cut to static. Jason was never seen again. As I closed the journal, my fingers trembled. The faint smell of iron filled the air around me, and I realized I was sitting only a few feet from the West Wing. I didn't dare look for a staircase. The house had already claimed enough souls. I wasn't about to be its next. Story 5. Hidden Traps in the House. The handwriting in the journal shifted again, now precise and meticulous, like the calculated strokes of an academic. This entry was attributed to Dr. Vivian Clark, a historian who specialized in uncovering the secrets of forgotten architecture. Her fascination with the mansion had led her to its doorstep, but her curiosity would unearth more than she had bargained for. The mansion's exterior was a Gothic marvel, its towering spires and intricate carvings whispering of a bygone era. Dr. Vivian Clark stood in its shadow, clutching a stack of old blueprints she'd acquired through an archivist friend. The house had been a puzzle for decades. Its recorded layout contradicted first-hand accounts from those who had dared enter. The historian in her was captivated by the inconsistencies. When she stepped inside, the air was heavy, the silence pressing down like a living thing. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, filtering through stained glass windows. Vivian set up her work table in the grand foyer, spreading out the blueprints and comparing them to the house around her. Her brow furrowed as she traced the inked lines with her finger. A hallway leading to the east wing was marked as a dead end on the plans, yet she could see it stretching into shadowed corridors before her. Hours passed, her notes accumulating with each new discovery. Then she noticed a faint draft coming from the study. Vivian followed the breeze, her lantern illuminating the peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. She tapped along the walls, the sound changing when she reached a portion that seemed hollow. Her pulse quickened as she pressed on the panel. With a groan, the false wall swung open, revealing a narrow passageway. The air that escaped was cold and damp, carrying the faintest trace of something metallic. Blood? Against her better judgment, Vivian stepped inside. The passage led to a series of hallways, each more labyrinthine than the last. The farther she ventured, the more the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavier, her footsteps echoing unnaturally as if the space was stretching and shrinking around her. At first, she dismissed the stains on the walls as water damage, but as her lantern light danced over them, the crimson streaks became unmistakable, bloody handprints smeared in frantic patterns. Panic clawed at her rational mind, but curiosity pushed her forward. She found remnants of those who had been there before. Faded notes littered the floor, their desperate messages etched into the yellowed paper. "Help me. Don't trust the shadows. It knows I'm here." Vivian's breath caught as she noticed something carved into the wall. Leaning closer, the words sent a chill down her spine. Her own name etched deep into the plaster. Her lantern flickered. A sound, faint at first but growing louder, reverberated through the hallway. It was a chorus of whispers and sobs, mingled with distant, inhuman screams. Vivian turned, trying to retrace her steps, but the labyrinth had shifted. The path she had taken was gone, replaced by new corridors stretching endlessly into the darkness. The whispers followed her, growing louder, sharper. Her footsteps quickened, her breath ragged as she ran through the maze, each turn leading her deeper into the house's suffocating embrace. She stumbled into a small chamber. The walls were lined with scratch marks, as if countless hands had tried to claw their way out. In the center of the room lay a shattered mirror, its fragments reflecting a distorted version of her panicked face. Vivian knelt, desperate to catch her breath, when she noticed her reflection moving independently of her actions. It mouthed one word: "Run." The maze began to collapse around her. Walls groaned and shifted, the whispers transforming into guttural growls. Vivian sprinted blindly, her lantern extinguished, leaving her in pitch darkness. Just when she thought the labyrinth would consume her, she saw it, a faint light. She clawed her way toward it, her hands bloody and raw from the jagged walls. She burst through the false panel, collapsing into the study. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Vivian never returned to the mansion. She published her findings, but the manuscript was filled with half-formed thoughts and erratic handwriting, a far cry from her usual precision. Friends and colleagues noted how she grew distant, haunted. The nightmares began soon after. Every night, she dreamed of wandering the labyrinth, the walls closing in, the whispers taunting her. And every morning, she awoke to find fresh scratches on her hands, as if she'd been clawing at something in her sleep. But the most chilling discovery came months later. Tucked into the pages of her notes was a photograph she didn't remember taking. It showed the wall in the labyrinth where her name had been carved. Beneath it, new words had appeared, etched as if by invisible hands. "You'll be back." The final page of the journal trembled in my hands. The handwriting grew more erratic, the ink smudged as if written in haste. My eyes darted over the scrawled words, piecing together a desperate account of someone who had once stood where I now sat. Each story, every eerie account, seemed to culminate in a chilling finality. I set the journal down, its weight far heavier than the leather binding should allow. The room felt different now, charged, alive, as if the walls themselves were listening. I tried to shake the unease, but the uncanny sensation that I was no longer alone clung to me like a second skin. That's when I heard it, the faint clinking of glasses. The sound came from the direction of the dining hall, barely perceptible but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine as memories of the first story flooded my mind. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by the vivid accounts I had just read. But as I turned my head, a cold draft brushed the nape of my neck. The air grew heavier, oppressive, as I sat frozen in the chair. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to flee the mansion and never look back. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. Somewhere behind me, a faint creak echoed, a sound too deliberate to be the settling of an old house. I spun around, the weak beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. Nothing, and yet, just at the edge of my vision, something shifted, a fleeting movement that my rational mind tried to dismiss. The journal on the table began to flutter, its pages flipping as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. My breath hitched, and I reached for it, But the moment my fingers touched the leather cover, it stopped. Compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I opened the journal again. The final page, previously blank, now bore a single line written in an unmistakable scrawl, my own handwriting. "You're next." My heart pounded as the room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the door, yanking it open only to be met with an impenetrable darkness. The mansion's grand foyer, once dimly lit by moonlight, was now swallowed in shadows. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The journal lay open on the table, and against my better judgment, I found myself drawn back to it. The words on the page began to rearrange themselves, shifting and reforming into an entry I hadn't seen before. It was my story. Every detail was there: my arrival at the mansion, my decision to stay the night, the moment I found the journal. The ink seemed to glisten, fresh and wet, as the account extended itself in real time, describing my current state of panic. I turned the page, desperate to stop reading, but the next words froze me in place. And then the house claimed them. The realization struck me like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a house. It was a living entity, feeding on the fears and traumas of those who entered. The stories in the journal weren't just tales of the past. They were warnings. And now, I was part of its legacy. The sound of whispers grew louder, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. I could hear fragments of voices, pleas for help, and sinister laughter. My own voice joined the chorus, screaming for escape even as my mind clouded, the house working its insidious magic. I don't know how much time has passed. The journal is in front of me again, the ink smudged on my hands. I've been writing, though I don't remember when I started. The words flow as if the house itself guides my pen. This will be the final entry. The house doesn't trap you physically. It lures you in, plays with your mind, and ensures you never want to leave, even when you know you should. If you find this journal, heed my warning: do not read it. Do not stay. But I know you won't listen. No one ever does.